Hi, everyone. So today I wanted to just finish up the gender chapter really quickly. So this should be a pretty short lecture and maybe get us started on, on moral development. Okay, so the last section of the gender chapter focuses on kind of breaking down what happens by gender by age. So from even in infancy, we see differential treatment between boys and girls. Adults tend to describe baby boys and girls differently. Sons are described as big guy and tiger, where girls are described as sweetie and sugar. The comments that adults make, so adults tend to comment on the strength of the cries or the infant's grasp if it's a boy, how soft or cuddly she is if it's a girl. And they perceive boys as being stronger and more coordinated and girls as being weaker and more awkward, even though there aren't any actual physical differences. So for example, some of these studies are really neat. They take a baby in gender neutral clothes and label it as a boy or a girl and have it cry at a surprising toy, and adults interpret the cry for boys as anger and for girls as fear. We also see that kids start to develop different expectations. So by age 1, they distinguish between males and females, and they look longer when the voices and faces don't match the gender. By age 2, they look longer if they perform gender inconsistent behavior versus consistent behavior. So very young, they have these expectations or stereotypes that develop. Around 2.5 to 3 years, they develop their own identity. They figure out whether they're a boy or a girl. We start seeing toy preferences where boys prefer trucks and girls prefer dolls and soft things. And these really indicate that they're learning gender norms. And so gender stereotypes really seem to be acquired by age 3. In terms of these toys and activities and careers, kids tend to assign gender stereotyped careers and respond negatively to counter stereotypical occupations. I'll post a link to a video on Moodle that does a really nice job kind of showing how cemented these gender stereotypes are. So you can take a look at that as well. We start to see gender rigidity before age 6. And so gender rigidity is when kids have very strict expectations about gender stereotypes. So they expect that all boys prefer boy toys, even if one is described as liking to play with girls and dolls. After age 6, they start getting gender constancy, where they understand that gender remains consistent regardless of the behavior. So they expect that some girls or some boys just prefer female activities, although they still are not terribly tolerant of these violations. They do understand that there are exceptions. We start seeing a lot of gender segregation and gender type behavior at age 3 and more in elementary school. And this is pretty universal. So at age 4.5 and 6.5, what you can see is kids tend to spend more time with the same sex, slightly less time with mixed sex groups, and very little time with the other sex. And this is particularly true as they start to get older. And we find that kids who segregate more are more popular and tend to be more socially skilled. So if you think about what this looks like on the elementary school playground, this is the, ew, boys have cooties kind of behavior. And this is associated with being well-liked by peers. And those kids who violate norms tend to be sometimes rejected and less well-adjusted. But as we've mentioned in class a few times, there is stronger pressure for boys to segregate and meet these expectations than for girls. Girls, it's more and more acceptable for them to be tomboys or athletes. It's less okay for boys to be feminine. So in a moment, we'll talk about those implications. In adolescence, there's a lot of interesting things going on where gender rigidity decreases in childhood, but it increases again in adolescence. So we get this process of gender intensification, where the sex differences are magnified in adolescence. They understand that these sex differences are social convention and can be changed, but they see violations as kind of an indicator of psychological abnormality. So for example, there was one study where they looked at kids ages 5 to 13 and described a boy wearing a barrette or a girl with short hair. And what they found was the two groups that had the most negative reactions were kindergartners, who have that gender rigidity, and the very oldest kids, adolescents, who have that gender intensification. So those were the groups that were most likely to judge it as really wrong. There's a lot of things that go into this. Pubertal changes and kind of preparation for reproductive activities means that physical changes make these kids look like adults and make gender all of a sudden very salient. There's also a lot of pressure for peer conformity, to conform to the norms to appeal to the opposite sex. And we even see this in kind of cognitive areas where girls tend to be less likely to take math and science classes. And one of the reasons is that they report they're afraid the boys won't like them if they don't conform to the stereotype. Now, this is a perceived pressure. This isn't necessarily really what boys think, but this is something that girls express concern over. But in later adolescence, we have more flexible thinking. Another thing that gender intensification can do is lead to homophobic bullying, because kids are really sensitive to violations of gender norms. We start seeing homophobic bullying start in middle school. This is, of course, when students might begin questioning their sexuality as well, which means it can be really, really difficult. And we do find that LGBT teens, many of them, 9 out of 10, are bullied, and they're significantly more likely than other kids to commit suicide. So this is something really kind of important to think about, these implications of gender intensification. Okay, and we also mentioned this idea of kind of problematic behaviors or expectation for boys as well. So if we think about what we teach boys about being male and being men, there tends to be this big push towards, you don't want to do sissy stuff, you don't want to be feminine, you need to be superior and competitive and independent and kind of power-oriented. And so these are the kinds of messages that boys get from pretty early on. And there's a significant amount of evidence that really suggests that boys would benefit from being encouraged to express their feelings and anxiety, because sometimes what happens is because they're encouraged to hide their feelings, they never really learn to regulate their emotions effectively. So this is one of the big negatives of traditional masculinity. And so what we find is a strong masculine role in adolescence is associated with problem behaviors, because what adolescents are doing is trying to validate their masculinity. So they may do things like premarital sex and alcohol and drugs and engage in delinquent activities as a way to kind of assert this powerful expectation of them. Kind of generally what we find is both boys and girls who have extremely gendered behavior have more problems. They have less school engagement and more school attachment, but I think it's generally, we tend to, when we talk about gender, we focus on the challenges for girls, but I think there are legitimate challenges for boys as well. Finally, it's important to note that this all happens within the context of culture. So what we consider gender norms, about gender role classification and personality traits are all kind of culturally prescribed behaviors. And so we see cultural differences. In the US, we're seeing kind of less traditional gender roles. So this figure is in response to the question or the statement, activities of a married woman is best confined to home and family. Obviously, you see the number of people endorsing this kind of statement decreasing pretty dramatically. In other cultures, this isn't necessarily the case, and we even see to the point of girls having less educational access and things like that. Okay, so that's the end of gender. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction to moral development. Your early moral dilemmas, we'll talk about those on Friday. So make sure you bring those to class on Friday and we will discuss those. And really, I just want to kind of give you a brief background, and on Friday we'll talk about your moral dilemmas and really start to go into the details of theories of moral development. But we define moral development as changes in thoughts, feelings, and behaviors regarding the standards of what's right and wrong. And it's important to kind of distinguish between the intrapersonal dimension and the interpersonal dimension. So the intrapersonal dimension really has to do with regulating your own behavior when you're not engaging in social interaction, where the interpersonal dimension has to do with kind of regulating social interaction and how you arbitrate conflict and things like that. Another important thing to think about is the 3 different components of morality. So we can actually divide moral development into 3 types. There's the affective, which has to do with those feelings of things like pride or guilt or shame. The emotional component, so these feelings of right and wrong, and these are what actually motivate our moral thoughts and actions. When we kind of evaluate whether we have exceeded or failed our moral standards, it leads to these emotions. Empathy is a big one. We'll talk about that, but it has to do with kind of vicariously experiencing someone else's feelings. So thinking about how they would feel in that situation, and that keeps them from doing harm to others. The cognitive component has to do with the thinking and our conceptualization of what is right or wrong, that decision making. How will I feel if I do it? If I wouldn't feel good, then maybe I shouldn't, those kinds of things. And then the behavioral component is what you actually do. So the decisions that have been made when you have the opportunity to cheat, do you actually do it? Interestingly, most of our behaviors are motivated by avoiding negative emotions. So for example, we see our grandparents out of guilt, not because of a positive emotion that we necessarily get when we do it to avoid the negative emotion. So this actually motivates a lot of our kind of moral behavior. So you can kind of keep these in mind as you're preparing your earliest moral dilemmas, and we will discuss those on Friday.